The blazing afternoon sun scorched the cracked pavement of a lonely country road, heat shimmering like waves rising from the asphalt. Out of place in the stillness was a gleaming red Shelby Mustang, hood thrust open like a gaping wound, its proud engine silenced by failure. Pacing beside it was a man whose polished shoes had never touched dirt roads, his gold watch flashing angrily in the light as he barked into a phone that offered no solutions. Every minute lost was another step closer to disaster, for this man had a meeting with the state's highest officials, and nothing in his world ever dared to make him wait. Until now. From the distance, a small figure approached. A 10-year-old black girl, her backpack nearly swallowing her thin frame, walked with cautious steps. Her braids bounced against an oversized MIT t-shirt, secondhand but worn with pride. She paused when her eyes caught the stranded car, and for a moment she considered walking on. After all, her aunt's warnings echoed in her ears. Never trust strangers, especially the kind who looked like they belonged in boardrooms, not broken down roads in a black neighborhood. But fate had other plans. In her bag lay a toolkit, gifted by her uncle, who taught her that even the smallest hands could repair what seemed impossible. What she didn't know, what neither of them could know, was that stopping to help that day would not only fix an engine, but uncover a secret buried for over a decade, a secret powerful enough to destroy an empire. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to Hidden Black Stories, where we bring you powerful tales of resilience, injustice, and the voices that history too often tries to silence. Maya Johnson was only 10 years old, yet her world had already taught her lessons most grown adults struggled to learn. She lived in a quiet, predominantly black rural community, nearly 2 hours outside the busy city of Boston. Life here was simple, sometimes harsh, but grounded in family and faith. The houses were small, the roads cracked, but the bonds between neighbors were strong. Everyone knew everyone, and survival often depended on looking out for one another. Maya's story, however, was never ordinary. Raised by her adoptive mother Diana until her tragic death, Maya now lived with her Aunt Renee and Uncle Leon. Leon worked long hours in his small repair shop, a man whose hands carried the smell of oil and grease, while Renee managed the household with a steady hand and protective eyes. Between them, they gave Maya love, structure, and a fierce reminder of where she came from. It was Uncle Leon who gave her the toolkit that now rattled inside her backpack. He believed knowledge was power, especially for children like Maya. "Engines don't care about your skin color," he would tell her. "If you can understand them, you can control something bigger than yourself." To him, teaching Maya to fix broken radios, engines, and bicycles wasn't just about mechanics. It was about preparing her to stand tall in a world that too often underestimated little black girls. Maya carried that lesson with her as she walked home from school every day, her head full of numbers, her hands eager to tinker. Yet despite her brightness, she felt the weight of being an outsider. Some kids at school teased her for always smelling faintly of oil. Others dismissed her dreams of becoming an engineer, saying, "Girls like you don't end up at MIT." She never said much back. She didn't have to. Every time she turned a broken machine into something that worked again, she proved them wrong in silence. That afternoon, the sight of the stranded red Mustang pulled her forward against her better judgment. The man beside it radiated wealth and impatience. His suit likely cost more than her family's entire month's income, and his frustration was as loud as the silence of the road. The scene was almost comical. A man who seemed to own the world brought low by a machine he couldn't control. Maya hesitated, hearing her aunt's warnings echo once again. In America, a little black girl approaching a wealthy white man was not a simple act of kindness. It could be misread, twisted, or even punished. But she also remembered Diana's words before she passed. "Never walk away from someone who needs help. One day, kindness will be your greatest strength." And so, with her heart pounding, Maya stepped forward. She carried no idea that this decision would unravel mysteries Diana had worked her whole life to protect. When Maya leaned over the hood, her small fingers tracing wires and hoses as if she were born to understand them, the man watched in silent disbelief. This child, dressed in hand-me-downs, displayed a confidence around engines that seasoned mechanics often lacked. She spotted the coolant leak, patched it temporarily, and instructed him on what to do next with a certainty that left him speechless. But then something shifted. As Maya brushed her braids aside, sunlight caught the emerald-green ring tied with thread around her tiny finger. The man froze. His gaze locked on the jewel as if the world had stopped spinning. For Maya, it was just a keepsake, a piece of her late mother she never let go of. But for Andrew Whitaker, heir to one of Boston's most powerful dynasties, it was the ghost of a promise he once made and failed to keep. In that instant, the balance of power on that quiet rural road shifted forever. Andrew Whitaker drove Maya home that day, still shaken by the sight of the emerald ring. His luxury car glided past faded houses and broken sidewalks that told stories of poverty and resilience. For him, it was a world he rarely saw, one his wealth and privilege had shielded him from. But for Maya, it was home. As she pointed the way toward her aunt and uncle's modest house, Andrew asked simple questions, masking the storm building inside him. How long had she lived here? Who had raised her after her mother's death? Where had she been before? Maya answered innocently, never realizing how each detail pierced deeper into Andrew's conscience. When she mentioned being adopted from a place called Little Angel's Orphanage, he nearly lost control of the steering wheel. That name had been buried for over a decade, hidden beneath contracts, sealed records, and the silence of those who had profited from its closure. But Andrew remembered. He remembered the children. He remembered the promises broken. And most of all, he remembered slipping that very ring onto a small girl's hand before she disappeared forever. After dropping Maya off, Andrew sat in his car, staring at the card he had handed her with trembling fingers. Something inside him knew this was no coincidence. It was a reckoning long overdue. That night, sleep abandoned him. In his office, he pulled out dusty files, hidden memos, and confidential reports. Each page painted a darker picture than the last. The Whitaker family hadn't just purchased an orphanage, they had dismantled it. Children with unusual gifts had been reallocated, their records erased, their futures dictated by forces they could not control. And among the names scribbled in red ink was one that now haunted him. Maya Johnson, Special Case, Contact HW. Meanwhile, life in Maya's home carried on in ordinary ways. She tinkered in her uncle's workshop, fixing old radios and battered engines, her small fingers moving with instinctive precision. Yet she couldn't shake the unease from that encounter on the road. The way Andrew looked at her ring, almost as if it held a story he wasn't telling, stirred questions she had learned to bury. Her Aunt Renee noticed too. That evening, when Maya casually mentioned the wealthy man and the business card he gave her, the room went still. Leon's face paled. Renee's hands trembled as she set down her glass. They had spent years keeping Diana's secret, shielding Maya from truths too dangerous for a child to carry. Now it seemed the past had found its way back to their doorstep. As Maya slept, Renee and Leon whispered in the kitchen. Diana had warned them that one day the Whitakers might come looking. She had stolen more than a child from that orphanage. She had stolen evidence, tucked away in places only Maya could unlock. If the Whitakers discovered the truth, Maya's life could be in danger. Their fears were not unfounded. Across the city, Andrew's father, Howard Whitaker, was already moving pieces into place. Though retired, Howard's influence remained vast, his empire built on power and intimidation. When he learned from Andrew that the girl with the emerald ring was alive, his reaction was not relief, but fury. To him, Maya wasn't a child to be protected. She was a liability, a living thread that could unravel everything he had built. Soon, black SUVs began appearing near Maya's school. Strangers in suits lingered by street corners, their eyes tracking her every move. What seemed like a chance encounter on a country road was now spiraling into a dangerous game of pursuit and concealment. Maya remained unaware of the storm gathering around her, but the adults in her life could see it clearly. Leon began parking across from her school each afternoon, keeping watch from the shadows. Renee checked the locks on the doors twice each night. And Andrew, torn between loyalty to his family and the truth of what had been done, secretly hired a private investigator to uncover the missing adoption records. Every discovery pointed to something darker. Children with extraordinary talents had vanished. Diana's fatal car accident looked less like an accident and more like a silencing. And at the center of it all was Project Prometheus, a secret initiative Howard Whitaker had championed to exploit those very children for profit and power. As the days passed, Maya's ring became more than a keepsake. It became a target, a key, and the men who wanted it back were willing to destroy anything in their way. The question was no longer whether Maya's past would catch up to her. The question was how far the Whitakers would go to keep their empire from crumbling. The night was thick with silence when Maya vanished. One moment she was riding her bike home from school, braids whipping in the wind, her backpack rattling with loose tools. The next, the bike lay abandoned at the curb, its wheels still spinning, the sound of squealing tires echoing into the distance. Renee's scream tore through the neighborhood when she saw the empty street. Leon ran from house to house, searching, pleading, but everyone knew the truth. This was no ordinary disappearance. The Whitakers had come for her. Miles away, in a fortified estate on the city's northern edge, Maya sat shivering in a cavernous room that smelled of leather and power. Towering portraits of stern-faced Whitakers glared down from the walls as if daring her to speak. At the far end of a polished mahogany table sat Howard Whitaker, his silver hair gleaming under the chandelier. To him, Maya was not a child, but a mistake, a living reminder of secrets never meant to surface. On the table before her lay the emerald ring. He had taken it from her trembling hand, holding it up as though it were a crown jewel. "Do you know what this means, child?" His voice was low, cold. That ring was never meant to be yours. It was a key. And you, whether you realize it or not, are the lock. Maya's wide eyes gave nothing away. She didn't understand the weight of his words, but she could feel their danger. Hours later, Andrew arrived, fury burning through his polished composure. He had followed the trail of black SUVs, ignoring the desperate calls from Renee and Leon, determined to put an end to the nightmare. When he stormed into the estate, Howard greeted him with the calm of a man who had orchestrated every move. "This is your doing," Andrew spat, pointing toward Maya. "She's just a child." Howard's expression hardened. "She's not just a child. She's evidence. Evidence of a program that could bring down everything we've built. If this story gets out, our empire collapses. You think politicians, bankers, and partners will stand by us once they know we trafficked children like cattle? No, Andrew. The girl cannot be allowed to live free." The words cut through Andrew like a blade. He had always known his father's ambition was ruthless, but hearing the truth laid bare made his stomach turn. He looked at Maya, her small frame dwarfed by the chair, her eyes fixed on the ring she no longer wore. In that moment, Andrew realized this wasn't just about one child. It was about every child silenced, every voice erased to protect men like Howard. Maya's innocence was now the battleground for their souls. Howard leaned forward, his voice a whisper that carried more threat than a shout. "You want to save her? Then destroy the files. Burn every record. Walk away and maybe she lives. But if you side with her, you destroy your family name, your future, everything." The room seemed to shrink as the ultimatum hung in the air. Andrew's mind raced. Loyalty to blood or loyalty to truth? His entire life had been scripted by Howard's will, but standing there, he saw the man not as a father, but as a tyrant who fed on silence. Before he could speak, the door burst open. Leon, reckless with rage, had broken into the estate, a crowbar clenched in his hand. Behind him, Renee stumbled in, breathless, tears streaming down her face. They had followed Andrew's trail, determined to bring Maya home no matter the cost. Chaos erupted. Guards lunged forward. Leon swung wildly, buying seconds of distraction. Renee rushed to Maya, clutching her niece as if letting go meant losing her forever. Howard roared, demanding control, his empire unraveling before his eyes. And then, silence. Andrew stepped between his father and the chaos, his voice steady for the first time in years. "This ends tonight." Howard's face contorted with fury. "If you betray me, you betray your own blood." Andrew shook his head. "Blood built on lies isn't family. It's a prison." For the first time, Howard saw defiance in his son's eyes and knew he had lost control. But victory was far from certain. The files still existed. The Whitaker empire still held power. And as sirens wailed faintly in the distance, summoned by neighbors who had seen the struggle, it became clear that exposing the truth would demand more than courage. It would demand sacrifice. The sirens grew louder, echoing through the Whitaker estate's marble halls like a warning bell long overdue. For the first time in decades, Howard Whitaker felt something unfamiliar: fear. He had built an empire untouchable by law, yet now the cracks split wide open, exposing the rot beneath the gilded walls. When the police stormed in, Leon stood protectively in front of Maya, crowbar still in hand, refusing to move until she was safe in Renee's arms. Andrew, his heart pounding, handed over a thick folder of files, the very documents his father had tried to bury. The officers hesitated at first, recognizing the weight of the Whitaker name, but the evidence was undeniable. Photographs, ledgers, names, children unaccounted for, Project Prometheus, laid bare. Howard was escorted away in handcuffs, his furious protests drowned by flashing cameras and the murmurs of betrayal. For decades, he had ruled through intimidation. But now the world saw him not as a titan of industry, but as a thief of innocence. His empire crumbled overnight. Business partners severed ties. Politicians scrambled to distance themselves. The Whitaker name, once synonymous with wealth and power, became a curse. But for Maya, the aftermath was not so simple. Even as she clutched Renee's hand and felt Leon's protective arm around her shoulders, questions gnawed at her. Why her? Why had her mother risked everything to save her? And what did it mean to carry a legacy so dangerous that men of power wanted her erased? The answers came slowly, through files Andrew unearthed and testimonies from other survivors who had lived in the shadows. Maya's mother, Diana, had not been a victim of chance. She had uncovered Project Prometheus and refused to let her daughter become another experiment in the Whitakers' empire. The ring, a simple emerald band, had been her silent act of rebellion, a marker of truth, a reminder that her child's identity would not be erased. Andrew, estranged from his family but free of its chains, became an unlikely ally to Maya. He testified in court, exposing not just Howard but the network of enablers who had profited from stolen lives. His choice cost him everything: his inheritance, his reputation among the wealthy. But for the first time, he stood tall, unshackled from the shadow of his father. The trials stretched on for years, and though justice was imperfect, the impact was undeniable. Families came forward, recognizing names in the files. Survivors found one another, piecing together fractured identities. Advocacy groups rallied around them, demanding reform in adoption systems and protections for vulnerable children. And through it all, Maya grew. She carried the weight of her past with quiet strength, channeling her pain into purpose. The little girl who once tinkered with broken radios became a young woman determined to repair something far greater, the broken systems that had nearly consumed her life. Scholarships opened doors, mentors nurtured her brilliance. She spoke at universities, telling her story not with bitterness, but with the unwavering conviction that silence protects the oppressor, while truth liberates the oppressed. Yet scars remained. Nights when the sound of tires on wet pavement jolted her awake. Days when the sight of a black SUV stirred panic in her chest, but she refused to let fear dictate her future. Her mother's courage flowed through her veins, steadying her when the world felt too heavy. One autumn evening, years after the night she was taken, Maya stood before a crowd at a memorial dedicated to the children lost to corruption and greed. The emerald ring, now strung on a silver chain around her neck, glistened in the fading light. She spoke of Diana, of the orphans whose names had been erased, of the empire built on their silence. And she spoke of resilience, how even in the darkest soil, roots of defiance grow, pushing toward the sun. Justice, she told them, is not always swift, it is not always complete, but it begins when one voice refuses to be silenced. My mother's voice was taken, but her truth lives on through me, through us. The crowd rose in quiet applause, many wiping tears, others clenching fists in solidarity. Among them were children who had once been hidden, now seen. Families reunited, communities strengthened. Maya descended from the stage, Renee and Leon waiting for her with proud smiles. Andrew stood off to the side, humbled, a man who had traded privilege for purpose. He knew his redemption would never erase the damage his family had done, but perhaps by standing with Maya, he could begin to tip the scales toward healing. As the night settled, Maya tilted her head toward the sky. The stars glittered, distant yet enduring, like her mother's love, always present even in the darkest nights. She clutched the emerald ring and whispered a promise, not just to Diana but to every child still fighting to be seen. They tried to erase us, but we are still here, and we will not be silenced. Her words lingered, carried by the wind, not just as a memory, but as a challenge. To the world, to the powerful, to anyone who dares to bury the truth.